a man who had everything, wealth, power, and the title of CEO, was also carrying a burden heavier than most could imagine. Behind his sharp suits and commanding presence, he was just a single father, struggling to balance boardroom decisions with bedtime stories. One evening, at the request of a close friend, he reluctantly agreed to a blind date, something he had no time or interest for. But fate had other plans. When his eyes met hers, not in a luxurious restaurant or a grand ballroom, but across a simple, quiet table, his world shifted. She wasn't like anyone he had ever known. Her clothes were plain, her life far from glamorous, yet her smile carried a warmth that pierced through the walls he had built around his heart. He went on that date as a favor, but in that single, fleeting moment, he realized he was no longer in control of his carefully guarded life, because love had found him where he least expected it. The world often looked at him and saw perfection. He was tall, striking, always dressed in tailored suits that fit like a second skin, the kind of man who carried an air of command even when silent. As the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation, he was the man people admired, envied, and sometimes feared. To outsiders, his life seemed flawless: a grand mansion, luxury cars, influence that reached across cities, and the kind of wealth most could only dream of. Yet when the lights dimmed, when the noise of the boardroom faded, and when the world's applause quieted, what remained was a man whose heart carried a weight no riches could ever ease. He was a single father, a man who loved his child more than anything, but who silently battled the loneliness that came with raising her alone. Each morning, before the chaos of business swallowed him whole, he would tiptoe into his daughter's room. She was the reason he kept moving, the reason he bore the long nights and endless stress. When her little arms wrapped around his neck, when she whispered, "I love you, Daddy," the hardened mask of the CEO slipped away, revealing a man who longed for simplicity, for love, for someone to see him as more than a provider. But his responsibilities weighed heavy. He had meetings that stretched for hours, negotiations that demanded his focus, employees who relied on his decisions. Between being a father and running an empire, he convinced himself there was no room left in his life for love. At times, when the house was quiet, he would sit alone by the window, staring out into the night. Memories of his past haunted him, the promises broken, the heartbreak that left scars deeper than anyone could see. Trust had once cost him everything, and since then, he had buried his heart beneath layers of caution. To the world, he was untouchable, but within, he was simply a man yearning for something real. He often wondered if he had built walls too high, if perhaps he had condemned himself to a life of success that tasted hollow when shared with no one. His daughter, too young to fully understand, would sometimes ask why she didn't have a mommy like other children. Each question pierced him deeper than any corporate failure ever could. He would smile, ruffle her hair, and say, "Because you and I are a team, and teams don't need anyone else." But when she turned away, his smile would falter, and the ache in his chest grew heavier. He knew she deserved more than just a father stretched thin between two worlds. She deserved a family, warmth, and a mother's love. And though he never admitted it aloud, he too longed for someone to share those quiet nights. Someone who could look past his wealth and power and see the man he truly was. His friends often teased him, telling him to move on, to open his heart again, but he brushed it off. Love, in his eyes, had become a dangerous gamble. He had poured everything into his company and his daughter, he had nothing left to risk. Yet beneath that armor, a part of him still yearned, a part he could never silence. Fate, however, has a way of stepping in when least expected, weaving moments into lives in ways no one can foresee. And so, even though he resisted, even though he convinced himself that love no longer had a place in his world, destiny had already set the stage for something he could not control. It began like any other day. A meeting ran longer than planned, his phone buzzed endlessly with messages, and his calendar was overflowing. He carried the weight of decisions that could change the future of hundreds of families employed under his leadership. Yet in the middle of that whirlwind, there was always the quiet reminder at home. A small pair of shoes by the door, drawings on the refrigerator, a giggle echoing down the hall. His daughter kept him human in a world that demanded him to be steel. She grounded him, reminding him why he fought so hard, why he carried such burdens without complaint. But even the strongest man can feel the sting of solitude. Nights were the hardest, when the house felt too big, the silence too loud. He sometimes caught himself imagining what it would feel like to share laughter across the dinner table, to watch his daughter's eyes light up not only at him, but at someone who loved them both. He wondered what it would be like to have someone who asked how his day was, not out of formality, but out of genuine care. He had convinced himself such dreams were luxuries he could no longer afford. His life was about stability, about providing, about protecting. Love was messy, unpredictable, and he had no time for uncertainty. And yet, deep down, he could not deny the truth. Beneath the layers of responsibility, beneath the polished image of a CEO, he was a man longing for connection. His soul craved what his wealth could not buy. A hand to hold when the world grew cold. A heart that beat in rhythm with his own. Someone who could step into his carefully guarded world and make it feel alive again. He never said it aloud. Never even admitted it to himself fully, but it lingered in the corners of his mind like a whisper. Every time he saw his daughter playing alone, or asking questions about families, that whisper grew louder. The ache became harder to ignore. His heart, though scarred, was still capable of love. And though he tried to suppress it, life had a way of nudging him toward the very thing he feared and longed for the most. Somewhere out there, he wondered, was there someone who could see him not as a CEO, not as a provider, not as a man broken by his past, but simply as a father, as a soul deserving of love? He didn't know then, but soon his carefully ordered life would be disrupted in ways he never imagined. Soon, he would learn that love doesn't ask for permission, doesn't wait for the right time, and doesn't care about walls or scars. Love comes uninvited, unexpected, and it changes everything. And for a man who believed his heart had no space left, destiny was preparing to prove him wrong. He hadn't wanted to go. The very idea of a blind date made him uncomfortable, almost irritated. His life had no room for such distractions, and his heart had long since locked itself away behind walls of responsibility and caution. But his closest friend was relentless, insisting that one evening of his time wouldn't ruin him. Just dinner. His friend had said. No commitments, no expectations. And after weeks of persuasion, he gave in, not because he wanted to, but because he was tired of arguing. He told himself it would be an act of courtesy, a way to repay his friend's loyalty. He walked into that evening fully convinced it would be meaningless. He couldn't have been more wrong. The restaurant wasn't as extravagant as the places he usually frequented. It was warm, almost humble, with soft lights hanging low and laughter echoing gently through the air. He expected someone polished, someone trying too hard to impress. Maybe even someone already aware of his name and his wealth. That was how it always went. People drawn to him not for who he was, but for what he represented. But when he saw her, sitting nervously at a table near the corner, his steps faltered. She was nothing like what he had imagined. Her dress was simple, almost too plain for the occasion, and yet she carried herself with a quiet grace that made her stand out in a way no luxury ever could. Her hair was tied back loosely, strands falling across her face, and when she looked up, her eyes held a mixture of shyness and sincerity. There was no calculation in her gaze, no expectation, no greed. She smiled nervously, and in that instant, something inside him shifted. It was as though the world had narrowed to just that table, just that girl, and the soft curve of her lips that felt more genuine than anything he had seen in years. He approached with the composure of a man who was used to hiding his emotions. Yet his heartbeat betrayed him. Sitting across from her, he noticed the small details, the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of the menu, the way she avoided holding his gaze for too long, the faint blush on her cheeks. She wasn't trying to impress him, in fact, she seemed unsure of why she was even there. And that honesty, that rawness, was what struck him the most. For the first time in a long time, he felt disarmed. Their conversation began awkwardly, as blind dates often do, but quickly unfolded into something unexpectedly natural. She spoke about her life with an openness that stunned him. She didn't have much. She worked hard just to make ends meet, lived in a small apartment, and carried dreams far bigger than her circumstances allowed. Yet, she spoke of it all with humility, never bitterness. Her laughter was soft but contagious, and when she described the little joys she found in simple things, he felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years. Longing. He found himself sharing more than he intended. He rarely spoke about his personal life on dates, especially about his daughter, but with her, the words came easily. Her eyes lit up when he mentioned her, and she asked questions with such genuine curiosity, not because she was impressed by the image of a wealthy man raising a child, but because she cared to know who he was beneath the surface. That was when he realized how rare this moment was. She wasn't drawn to his power, his status, or his wealth. In fact, it seemed like none of those things even crossed her mind. She was seeing him, not the CEO, not the successful figure admired by the world, but the man. Dinner stretched longer than either of them expected. He laughed more that evening than he had in years, and he noticed how her presence softened the sharp edges of his soul. She reminded him of something he had forgotten. A sense of simplicity, of truth, of warmth that had nothing to do with money or image. For once, he wasn't performing, wasn't carrying the weight of expectations. He was just a man sitting across from a woman who made him feel alive again. When the night ended, he found himself reluctant to leave. He walked her outside, where the cool air brushed against their skin, and for a moment they stood in silence, neither knowing what to say. He noticed the worn-out strap of her handbag, the scuffed shoes that told stories of long walks and long days, and instead of judgment, all he felt was admiration. She carried herself with dignity despite having so little. It humbled him in a way he couldn't explain. As she smiled softly and said goodnight, he realized with startling clarity that something inside him had changed. He had gone into the evening believing it was a meaningless favor, but it had become something far more significant. He had been reminded that love wasn't about grandeur or perfection. Sometimes, it was about a fleeting connection, a spark that ignited when two souls recognized each other, even from different worlds. Driving home, he couldn't shake her from his thoughts. Her laughter echoed in his mind, her kindness lingered in his chest, and her honesty replayed in every silence. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the heavy loneliness pressing down on him. Instead, he felt hope, fragile, terrifying, but undeniable. He wondered what his daughter would think of her, how she would smile at the warmth this woman carried so effortlessly. And yet, doubt crept in. Their worlds were oceans apart. He was a man of power and privilege, and she was a woman who had little but her strength and dreams. What right did he have to bring her into a life so vastly different from her own? What if his world crushed the purity he had seen in her? Still, no matter how many questions raced through his mind, his heart refused to let go of the way it had leapt when he first saw her smile. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if their paths would truly cross again beyond that night. But he did know one thing. He had walked into that restaurant as a man doing a favor for a friend, and he had walked out with his heart unexpectedly awakened. It was as though fate had gently, but firmly, reminded him that love doesn't care about plans, titles, or differences. Love simply arrives, uninvited and unstoppable, and when it does, it changes everything. That night, lying awake in the quiet of his home, he thought of her again and again. The simplicity of her presence, the honesty in her voice, the light in her eyes. It all stayed with him, refusing to fade. For a man who had believed his life had no room for love, the truth became undeniable: he had fallen. Deeply and irreversibly, for a poor girl he had met on a blind date. And it was only the beginning of a story neither of them had ever expected.